Windermere Library perched on the edge of a small square paved with cobblestones, its dark stone facade staring out across a row of rain-slicked shop fronts. Lanterns burned low as evening fell, throwing flickering shadows up the library's ancient pillars. Inside, the hush felt deeper than silence. Every creak of the wooden floor echoed between the towering shelves, and the air smelled of paper, leather bindings, and the faint tang of dust. Callum Price leaned over the returns desk, stacking a pile of books with careful precision. The clock over the front entrance read 11:47 p.m. The last patrons had left an hour ago, and now only the rustle of his own movements filled the air. He liked the library at night. It was a place where time seemed suspended, as though the world outside had forgotten to keep turning. Mrs. Alder, the head librarian, shuffled past him carrying a box of yellowing index cards. "I'm off, dear. Don't stay too late." Callum smiled faintly. "I'll just finish the donations." Mrs. Alder squinted at him over her glasses. "Remember, the library has moods after midnight." He chuckled. "Moods?" She tapped her cane on the floor. "Books remember things. Buildings, too. Be careful what you wake up." And with that cryptic warning, she disappeared through the arched doors, leaving Callum alone beneath the high, vaulted ceiling. He stared at the doors for a long moment. Then he sighed and turned back to the donation cart. He didn't notice the lamp flicker to life at the far end of the library. Callum glanced up as the faint glow caught his eye. A brass reading lamp, tucked between two towering bookshelves, burned gently where it should have been dark. He frowned. He was certain he'd switched off every lamp himself. Curiosity nudged him forward. He wove between shelves, footsteps muffled by the thick, faded carpets. The spines of ancient books loomed around him, titles stamped in gold leaf, smelling of ink and secrets. As he neared the lamp, he heard it, a soft rustling, like pages turning. He stopped, heart thudding, and listened. "Hello?" he called. Silence. He stepped into the pool of lamplight. The old wooden table beneath the lamp was empty except for a single large book bound in deep burgundy leather. Its cover bore no title. Callum stared at it, shivers crawling along his neck. He reached out and gently flipped it open. Every page was blank. He frowned, turning pages faster, hoping to find something, any words, any sign of writing. But sheet after sheet was empty, the creamy paper soft beneath his fingers. Then he heard a woman's voice behind him, soft as breath. "Don't leave me unread." Callum whirled around. A woman stood a few feet away, half-shadowed between two shelves. She wore a high-collared dress of shimmering gray satin, the style impossibly old-fashioned. Her dark hair was piled into elegant twists. Her eyes were enormous, luminous pools of sorrow. He took a step back. I didn't see you come in." "We're closed." The woman tilted her head, studying him. "I've been waiting, such a long time." Callum's voice came out barely louder than a whisper. "Waiting for what?" The woman glided closer, the fabric of her gown making no sound against the carpet. Up close, her skin seemed almost translucent under the lamplight, as if she were carved from moonlight and silk. "To finish my story," she murmured. Her gaze dropped to the open book on the table. "It's been empty for so long." Callum glanced at the blank pages. You wrote this?" A flicker of sadness crossed her face. "I tried. But the ending wouldn't come. And now—" She lifted her hand as if to touch the book, but hesitated. Her fingers hovered above the paper, trembling. "Now I can't leave." Callum felt a chill trace his spine. "Leave? You mean the library?" She met his eyes. "This place keeps me. It remembers me." He swallowed hard. "Look, miss, I don't know what you're talking about, but you're not supposed to be here. Maybe I can call someone for you." Her eyes flashed, deep as storm clouds. "Don't call anyone." For the first time, her voice carried a sharp edge, and the lamp beside them flickered violently. Shadows leapt across the walls, stretching and twisting like long fingers. Callum took another step back, pulse hammering. The woman blinked, her gaze softening once more. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to frighten you. He stared at her, trying to calm the roaring in his ears. Who are you? She lowered her eyes. My name was Eleanor Whitcomb. Callum blinked. The name sounded vaguely familiar, like something he'd once read but couldn't quite place. Eleanor Whitcomb? He repeated. Are you a patron? Or an actress, maybe? Some kind of historical reenactor? A faint smile touched Eleanor's lips, though her eyes remained sorrowful. I suppose I was many things once, but not anymore. She glanced around the library, as if listening for something beyond the edges of hearing. This place keeps the voices of everyone who's ever stepped inside. It remembers secrets even people forget. Callum tried to steady his voice. Okay. Let's just slow down. Are you hurt? Do you need help getting home? Her expression darkened. I can't go home. My home is gone. He frowned. Gone where? Eleanor's gaze drifted toward the vaulted ceiling. Ashes. Dust. Time sweeps everything away. A hollow ache settled in Callum's chest. Something about her sadness reached into places he didn't often let himself feel. He hesitated, then stepped closer. Why can't you leave the library? She looked at him with eyes shining like wet ink. Because my story has no ending. Callum blinked. What does that mean? She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and began gliding deeper into the stacks. Without quite knowing why, Callum followed her, his footsteps silent on the old carpet. As they walked, the shadows seemed to lengthen, swallowing the pools of light. Callum hurried after Eleanor, weaving between towering shelves that seemed to close in like the walls of a maze. The deeper they went, the older the books appeared, thick tomes bound in cracked leather, their titles faded into obscurity. Eleanor, wait! He called, breathless. She paused beneath an arched window where moonlight streamed through stained glass, casting jeweled patterns on the floor. She looked impossibly ethereal there, her gown shimmering like liquid silver. I tried so hard, she whispered. I sat in this library every night, scribbling words by lamplight. But the words kept vanishing, as if the pages were swallowing them. Callum stared at her, chills crawling over his arms. What do you mean, vanishing? She turned sorrowful eyes toward him. The library took my story. It devours unfinished tales. And now it has me. He swallowed. Are you saying the library is alive? Eleanor nodded. It breathes. It listens. It doesn't like stories without endings. He managed a weak laugh. That's a bit much, don't you think? Eleanor's gaze hardened. Listen. She held up a finger, and Callum fell silent. In the hush, he heard it, a faint whispering, like hundreds of pages turning all at once. It seemed to come from everywhere. Eleanor murmured. The library is always reading. It's searching for the stories it can finish. Callum's stomach twisted. And if it can't? She met his eyes, her voice barely audible. It keeps the author until it can. Callum shivered, the tiny hairs on his arms standing on end. Eleanor, are you saying you've been here all this time? She tilted her head slightly. I've tried to leave. Many times. But every door I open leads me back to the shelves. She reached out, fingers brushing the spines of books beside her. I can't step into the world until my story is finished. Callum rubbed his forehead. But what story? What was it about? Eleanor stared off into the darkness, voice dropping to a near whisper. It was a mystery, a tale of secrets hidden beneath the floorboards of an old house. A story about betrayal and love, and a key that unlocked more than just a door. Callum blinked. Why couldn't you finish it? A flicker of anguish crossed her face. Because he took the ending away from me. He? Callum asked. Who's he? Eleanor hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as though afraid to speak the name. A man who came here long ago. He said he wanted to help me write my story. But he stole my words instead. Callum felt a sick twist in his stomach. Stole your words? Eleanor nodded. He wrote them into his own book. Claimed my story as his. Left me behind to fade into the shells. Callum frowned. That's awful. Do you know his name? Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. Mr. Barlow. Thunder rumbled in the distance, shaking dust from the high windows. Callum blinked, staring at her. Mr. Barlow. I've seen that name before. Eleanor stepped closer, hope flickering in her luminous eyes. You've seen his name? Callum nodded, mind racing. I was cataloging old donation books last week. One of them was signed Jonathan Barlow. I thought it was just an old author. The book was titled The House Beneath the Key. Eleanor sucked in a sharp breath. That's my story's name. He changed it slightly, but it's mine. Callum swallowed. But that book, it was published in the late 1800s. Eleanor lifted her chin. So was I. Callum stared at her, chest tightening. Wait, are you saying you're dead? She finished softly. Yes. He staggered back a step, clutching the edge of the shelf for balance. Eleanor's voice gentled. Don't be afraid. I'm not here to harm you. I just need your help. Callum struggled for words. You've been trapped here for over a century? Eleanor nodded. I can't cross over. Not while my story belongs to someone else. He glanced around at the towering shelves, the hush pressing in. But how could a library trap a soul? She looked at him solemnly. This library was built on old ground. Sacred ground. It's always been a place of knowledge and secrets. Sometimes it keeps more than just books. A tremor passed through the floorboards beneath them, rattling the shelves. Books shifted, as if bracing for some unseen wind. Eleanor whispered, It knows we're talking about it. Callum's breath itched. Then, what do we do? Eleanor met his eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. You must help me finish my story, or we'll both be lost in these stacks forever. Callum stared at Eleanor, pulse roaring in his ears. Lost? Forever? He echoed. How could I get trapped here? Eleanor looked stricken. Because now you know too much. The library marks those who hear its secrets. It claims them. He ran a shaking hand through his hair. This is insane. Libraries don't claim people. Eleanor lowered her eyes. Did you hear the whispers earlier? Callum hesitated. He thought of the rustling sounds, the sense of hundreds of invisible eyes watching him from between the shelves. Yes, he admitted. I heard them. Then it's already begun, she said. He swallowed hard. Okay. Let's say I believe you. How do I help you finish the story? I'm not a writer. Eleanor's expression softened, almost tender. But you're a reader. You know how stories feel. How they end. She turned, beckoning him deeper into the stacks. Come. I want to show you something. Reluctantly, Callum followed. The air seemed to grow colder as they moved further into the depths of the library. Shelves leaned at odd angles, as though the entire building were exhaling. At last, Eleanor stopped in front of a narrow wooden door tucked behind a tapestry depicting an old coat of arms. She laid a hand on the latch. This is the reading room of forgotten books, she murmured. It's where the library keeps stories that were never finished. Callum stared at her. There's a whole room for that. Eleanor nodded. A room full of ghosts waiting for endings. She pushed the door open. A soft gust of cold air spilled out as Eleanor swung open the door. Callum hesitated on the threshold, peering inside. Rows of narrow shelves stretched into darkness, each shelf crowded with books bound in faded leather and cloth. Unlike the orderly stacks outside, these shelves tilted and sagged as though burdened by secrets too heavy to bear. A pale glow shimmered faintly overhead, like starlight trapped beneath a roof. Dust motes danced in the air, swirling in slow spirals. Callum whispered, This place feels different. Eleanor stepped inside, her skirts whispering over the floor. It's alive with unfinished stories. Every word someone began but never completed, it's all kept here. Callum moved closer to one of the shelves. He reached out and touched a spine. It vibrated faintly under his fingertips, almost like a heartbeat. He pulled back quickly. Why does it feel alive? Eleanor gave him a sorrowful smile. Because the stories are still waiting for someone to read them. Or finish them. She reached for a book and gently slid it from the shelf. Its cover was dark green velvet, the title embossed in gold letters that flickered as though lit from within. The Hollow Garden. Eleanor read aloud. I remember when she started this one, a young woman named Margaret. She wrote 50 pages before she lost her sight. The story weeps every night for an ending. Callum swallowed hard. It weeps? Eleanor nodded. Sometimes, if you listen closely, you'll hear the pages sobbing. A low, rustling sigh filled the room, as if 100 voices were whispering all at once. Callum shivered. So, my helping you finish your story would release you? Yes, she said. And perhaps free others as well. Callum stared at Eleanor, heart pounding. But how do I finish a story you started over 100 years ago? Eleanor placed the green velvet book gently back on the shelf. The words live inside me. I remember the characters, the secrets, the clues. I can tell you what must happen. You'll help me write it down. Callum hesitated. And if I refuse? A sorrowful shadow crossed her face. Then the library will keep you too. It will wait until you try to leave, and you'll find yourself right back here. He shook his head, struggling to grasp it all. That's impossible. People would come looking for me. Mrs. Alder, my friends. Eleanor's eyes glimmered with sympathy. The library has many rooms no one else sees. People might search, but you'd be hidden away, among the unfinished stories. A cold shiver traced Callum's spine. Eleanor stepped closer. Please, Callum. I've waited so long. I don't want to fade away. Help me finish my story, and you can leave. He looked around at the shelves full of silent books, imagining countless voices trapped within. Finally, he whispered, Okay. Tell me what happens next. A slow, radiant smile spread across Eleanor's face, delicate and heart-wrenching. Come, she said. There's something you must see first. A clue hidden long ago. She reached for his hand. At her touch, an icy chill shot through his skin, but he didn't pull away. Together, they stepped deeper into the shadows of the reading room, past shelves that seemed to close around them like the ribs of a great beast. Somewhere ahead, a faint light beckoned. The faint light grew brighter as Eleanor led Callum through a narrow aisle. The shelves gave way to a small circular chamber, lined with dark wooden panels etched with symbols he didn't recognize. In the center stood an old wooden lectern. Resting on it was a massive book bound in black leather, its cover embossed with a single silver key. Eleanor approached the lectern reverently. This is the Ledger of Unfinished Tales. It records every story trapped in the library, and every soul bound here. Callum's mouth went dry. Every soul? She nodded. Including mine. And now yours. He blinked. Wait, my name is in that book? She gently opened the ledger. Its pages were pale as parchment, covered in delicate script that seemed to shimmer in the lantern glow. Eleanor turned pages swiftly, her fingers trembling. There, she whispered, tapping a line near the bottom of a page. Callum leaned closer. He read the words. Callum Price. The unwritten ending. Bound to the tale of Eleanor Wickham. Status, in progress. His stomach lurched. This is crazy. How is my name in there already? Eleanor's eyes glistened. The library writes its own records. Once you entered my story, it claimed you. Callum clenched his fists. Then we need to finish it. Fast. Eleanor nodded, though fear lingered in her gaze. I began my story in a journal hidden here in the library. It holds clues we'll need. Where is it? Callum demanded. Eleanor hesitated. It's kept in the librarian's vault. And no one is allowed inside without the head librarian's key. Callum blinked. Mrs. Alder's key? Eleanor nodded gravely. Callum swallowed hard. So, if we get Mrs. Alder's key, we can get your journal? Eleanor nodded. It's the only way. My journal has the original plot. The names, the secrets, the ending I never finished. Callum paced a few steps, rubbing his temples. Mrs. Alder already thinks the library has moods. Maybe she knows more than she's letting on. Eleanor's eyes turned distant. She does. She's the guardian of the vault. Librarians have always known the library is more than stone and shelves. Callum's voice dropped. Then why hasn't she helped you? A flicker of sadness crossed Eleanor's face. Because helping me might unleash the library's wrath. It doesn't like stories being taken away. A low groan seemed to ripple through the walls around them, as though the building itself were listening. Callum glanced around nervously. Okay. So how do we get the key? Eleanor lowered her voice. Mrs. Alder wears it on a silver chain. She never takes it off. He sighed. Perfect. Eleanor's expression grew determined. Tomorrow, when the library opens again, you must speak to her. Convince her to let us into the vault. Callum hesitated. And if she refuses? Eleanor's voice dropped to a chilling whisper. Then we may have to take it. He stared at her. Steal from Mrs. Alder? Eleanor's face tightened. I don't want to. But if we don't finish my story, the library will claim you, Callum. Just like it claimed me. Callum clenched his jaw, heart pounding. Then we'll get that key. When the clock chimed 3, the library shuddered as if exhaling a tired breath. Eleanor's glow seemed to dim, her edges blurring slightly. I must go, she murmured, voice echoing like fading music. The library pulls me back at dawn. I'm part of it now. Callum stepped forward. Wait, what if I need to talk to you tomorrow? She held his gaze. Come to the reading room at midnight. I'll find you. And with that, she seemed to dissolve, her form drifting into wisps of pale smoke that scattered into the shadows between shelves. Callum stood alone, heart racing, surrounded by towering books. Silence folded in around him like a velvet cloak. Eventually, he forced himself to leave the reading room, retracing his steps through winding corridors. As he stepped into the main hall, he glanced at the clock, 4:02 a.m. Outside, dawn was breaking. By midday, Callum was back at the library's front counter, exhaustion tugging at his eyelids. Mrs. Alder bustled in, wearing a floral scarf and carrying a heavy leather bag. Well, you look like a ghost yourself, dear, she said, peering at him over her glasses. Callum tried to laugh. Rough night. Mrs. Alder gave him a sharp look. Did you see anything unusual? He hesitated, choosing his words. Mrs. Alder, can I ask you something? The librarian's vault, what's in there? Her eyes flickered. She set her bag down with a soft thump. Why would you ask me that? Callum swallowed. I think something important is locked inside. Something that could help someone. Mrs. Alder's voice dropped to a near whisper. The vault holds dangerous things, Callum. Things the library would rather keep hidden. Callum leaned closer over the counter. Mrs. Alder, please. I need to see what's in there. It might save someone. Mrs. Alder shook her head slowly. Some stories were buried for good reason, dear. The vault is locked for the safety of everyone, living or otherwise. Callum hesitated. You know about the spirits, don't you? Mrs. Alder's eyes darted around to make sure no one was listening. Then she lowered her voice. Windmere Library was built on ground soaked with secrets. It's older than this town, older than most remember. The walls remember every word ever whispered in them. Callum felt his skin crawl. So it's true. The library traps people. Mrs. Alder's lips pressed into a thin line. Sometimes. When stories are left unfinished, or when they're stolen. Callum blinked. You knew about Eleanor. Mrs. Alder sighed. Eleanor Wickham was one of our brightest patrons. brilliant mind. She was writing a novel the town would have cherished. Then Jonathan Barlow took it from her, and vanished. Not long after, Eleanor disappeared as well. Callum clenched his fists. She's still here. She's trapped because her story was never finished. Mrs. Alder's eyes turned sorrowful. I've tried to help her, Callum. But the library resists. It's possessive of what it claims. Callum swallowed. Then help me get her journal. Let me try. Mrs. Alder hesitated, fingers brushing the silver key on her chain. The vault is dangerous, Callum. It's filled with fragments of stories so powerful they warp the walls around them. Callum stared into her eyes. Please. Eleanor's waited long enough. Mrs. Alder regarded him for a long, heavy moment. The library seemed to hush around them, as if the shelves themselves were listening. Finally, she exhaled. If I help you, Callum, there's no going back. The library will remember what we've done. Callum leaned in. I'm already in the ledger. I'm not leaving Eleanor behind. A shadow passed across Mrs. Alder's lined face. Very well. Meet me tonight after closing. Midnight. Callum blinked. Tonight? She nodded firmly. We'll open the vault. But you must listen to me once we're inside. Do nothing unless I say. Touch nothing unless I tell you. Agreed, Callum said at once. Mrs. Alder seemed about to say more, then thought better of it. She simply turned and shuffled off toward the archives, leaving Callum staring after her. That night, the library fell silent after the last patron left. Callum helped Mrs. Alder draw the heavy drapes over the windows and turn off the overhead lights. The hush was so profound it felt almost holy. Mrs. Alder beckoned him with one gnarled finger. Come, dear. They crossed the main hall to a small wooden door hidden behind a velvet curtain. Mrs. Alder withdrew the silver key from her chain and inserted it into a tiny lock. Click. She pushed the door open, revealing a narrow spiral staircase descending into darkness. A cold draft swept upward, carrying scents of dust, old ink, and something sharper, like ozone before a storm. Mrs. Alder whispered, This is the place the library tries hardest to hide. Callum swallowed, his mouth dry. Let's go. They stepped down into the shadows. The spiral staircase seemed to go on forever. Callum's footsteps echoed against stone walls slick with moisture. Dim lanterns flickered in sconces, their glow barely pushing back the shadows. Mrs. Alder moved surprisingly quickly for her age. Stay close, she murmured. There are turns in this stairwell that don't always lead where they should. Callum frowned. What does that mean? She gave him a grim look. Sometimes the library rearranges itself. People have gone into these stairs and come out, somewhere else. Callum swallowed hard but kept descending. At last, the stairs ended at a heavy iron door carved with strange runes. Mrs. Alder laid her palm flat against it. A soft blue light pulsed under her hand, and with a deep groan, the door swung inward. Inside lay a vast chamber lit by rows of glowing crystal lanterns suspended from chains. Tall wooden cabinets lined the walls, each locked with brass hasps. Tables stood scattered through the room, covered with dusty objects. Old journals, cracked quills, dried flowers pressed between glass, locks of hair tied with ribbons. The air smelled sharp, electric, like old magic. Mrs. Alder spoke in a hushed tone. Welcome to the librarian's vault. This is where the library stores unfinished stories, and the relics tied to them. Callum stepped forward cautiously, eyes wide. It's like a museum. Mrs. Alder nodded. A dangerous museum. Some of these items carry echoes of their stories. They can whisper to you, tempt you to finish them. Callum glanced around, heart thudding. How do we find Eleanor's journal in all this? Mrs. Alder pursed her lips. Come. I know where it's kept. She led him deeper between towering cabinets. Mrs. Alder moved with certainty through the vault, weaving between cabinets labeled in faded gold lettering. Stories of betrayal. Incomplete loves. The lost names. Dreams unwritten. Each cabinet hummed faintly, as though a breeze rustled through the pages locked inside. They reached a narrow aisle where a glass case stood illuminated under a single crystal lantern. Inside, resting on dark velvet, lay a slim leather-bound journal, the initials EW pressed into the cover. Callum's breath caught. "That's it." Mrs. Alder held up a hand. "Don't touch it yet." She circled the case, murmuring softly. Symbols glowed faintly along the glass, wards and protections Callum couldn't begin to understand. At last, she nodded. "It's safe now." She lifted the glass lid and carefully picked up the journal, cradling it as though it might shatter. Callum reached out. "Can I?" Mrs. Alder hesitated. Then she placed it in his hands. The leather felt cold at first, but then a warmth pulsed through his palms, like a faint heartbeat. As his fingers brushed the cover, words spilled into his mind, as if Eleanor were whispering directly to him. Fragments of sentences, images of old houses, keys turning in locks, tears sliding down Eleanor's pale cheek. Callum gasped and nearly dropped the journal. Mrs. Alder caught it, steadying him. "Easy, dear. The stories are eager to be read." He blinked, shivering. "It's alive." Mrs. Alder nodded grimly. "All unfinished stories are, in their way." She closed his fingers around the journal once more. "Now, let's bring it upstairs. But remember, reading it may awaken more than just words." They made their way back up the spiral stairs, the journal clutched tight in Callum's trembling hands. As they stepped into the main hall, the silence seemed deeper, as if the entire library were holding its breath. Mrs. Alder guided Callum to a secluded study room. Dust motes spiraled in the beam of a single desk lamp, illuminating rows of books stacked like silent sentinels. "Sit," Mrs. Alder urged. Callum dropped into the chair, setting the journal on the desk. Its cover seemed to pulse faintly under the lamplight, as though eager to be opened. Mrs. Alder took a seat opposite him, folding her hands. "Now listen to me, dear. This journal holds powerful echoes. It might show you things. You may feel emotions that aren't your own." Callum licked his dry lips. "Is it safe?" She hesitated. "Safe is not quite the word I'd use." Callum took a deep breath and flipped open the journal. The first page was delicate, the ink faded but legible. March 2nd, 1873. The story begins in the hollow house, under the weight of secrets locked behind the cellar door. As he read aloud, a sharp chill swept the room. The lamplight flickered. For a heartbeat, Callum felt as though he stood not in the library, but in a dusty Victorian parlor, surrounded by dark paneling and the faint scent of lavender and smoke. He blinked rapidly, heart thudding. "Did you feel that?" Mrs. Alder's voice was calm but strained. "The story's pulling you in. Keep going, but slowly." Callum turned another page. More words waited there, curling across the paper like delicate vines. Suddenly, a familiar voice whispered from behind him. "Callum!" He turned, and there stood Eleanor, her gray eyes glistening in the lamplight. Eleanor hovered at the edge of the lamplight, her gown shimmering like mist. Her voice was soft, trembling with emotion. "You found it," she whispered. "My journal." Callum exhaled shakily. I'm trying to help you." She stepped closer, her fingers hovering over the open pages. "The hollow house. That's where my story was set. A house of secrets. And of betrayal." Mrs. Alder eyed Eleanor warily. "Careful, dear. Don't let it draw you in too deeply." Eleanor's gaze flicked toward Mrs. Alder. "He has to finish it, or none of this will ever end." Callum cleared his throat, eyes dropping back to the journal. "So, what happens next?" Eleanor drew in a long breath. "There's a man in the story. Charles Lovelace. He discovers a hidden door beneath the cellar stairs. Behind it lies the ledger of all the town's secrets." Mrs. Alder frowned. "A ledger, like the one that holds your name now." Eleanor nodded gravely. "Jonathan Barlow stole that idea from me. He published it as his own. But he never found my true ending." Callum leaned forward, intrigued despite the fear prickling his skin. What's the real ending? Eleanor lowered her eyes. In my story, Charles finds more than secrets. He finds the truth about who killed Lydia Gray. Mrs. Alder stiffened. Lydia Gray, that's an old Windermere scandal. A young woman vanished without a trace. Eleanor's eyes glistened. It wasn't just a story. Lydia was real. And the man who killed her was the same man who stole my words. Callum blinked. You're saying Jonathan Barlow murdered Lydia Gray? Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. Yes. And he buried the truth in my story. Callum stared at Eleanor, stunned. So Barlow wasn't just a thief, he was a murderer? Eleanor nodded, her expression haunted. He wrote himself out of suspicion, hid the truth inside fiction so no one would ever look for the real Lydia Gray. Mrs. Alder pressed trembling fingers to her lips. That's why the library won't let go of your story. It's not only unfinished, it's a crime unsolved. Eleanor whispered. The library knows the truth. It's been trying to find someone to help me tell it. Callum swallowed. What exactly does your journal say about Lydia? Eleanor reached over his shoulder, her translucent fingers brushing the page. Words appeared where before the paper had been blank, ink spiraling across the parchment as if written by an invisible hand. The night of Lydia's death, Jonathan Barlow followed her into Hollow House. He argued with her about the ledger she'd discovered. When she threatened to expose him, he pushed her, and she fell down the cellar stairs. Mrs. Alder gasped. My stars! Callum read aloud, voice trembling. He buried her body beneath the cellar floor and sealed the room. Then he wrote her into Eleanor's novel, to hide the truth in fiction. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. I tried to finish the story, to tell what really happened, but the library swallowed my words. It wouldn't let me write the ending, unless someone else believed it too. Callum clenched his jaw. Well, I believe you. Mrs. Alder's eyes were fierce. Then we must finish your story, and expose Barlow's crimes, even if he's long dead. Eleanor nodded solemnly. But there's still one piece missing, the ledger. It's real, and it's still hidden, Callum whispered. In Hollow House? Eleanor met his gaze. Yes. Callum felt as though the room had shrunk around him. He gripped the edge of the table. So, there's a real ledger. And it's still hidden in Hollow House. Eleanor nodded. Barlow wrote about it in his stolen novel. But he left out the most important detail, where it truly is. Mrs. Alder leaned closer. And your journal holds clues to the ledger's location? Yes, Eleanor said softly. I left hints scattered through my pages. The library tried to erase them, but some survived. Callum glanced down at the journal. Then we'll read it all. Find every clue. Eleanor's eyes glistened. We must hurry. The longer a truth is buried, the stronger the library's hold becomes. Mrs. Alder hesitated. Hollow House has been boarded up for decades, Callum. It's dangerous. People say the place is cursed. Callum's mind whirled. Even if it is, if there's proof of Lydia's murder inside, we have to find it. Eleanor spoke gently. I'll help guide you. I still remember every brick, every stair. Callum met Mrs. Alder's gaze. Will you help us? The old librarian sighed deeply. I'm too old to crawl around cellar floors, dear. But I'll help prepare you. And I'll keep the library from interfering, as best I can. Eleanor reached for Callum's hand. Though her touch was cool and ghostly, warmth spread through his chest. You're the only one who's listened in over a century. Callum squeezed her fingers. Then let's finish your story. Mrs. Alder murmured. Before the library decides to write an ending of its own. Outside the tall windows, wind rose in a mournful howl, rattling the glass like distant whispers. By the following night, rain lashed the windows of Windermere Library, drumming a restless rhythm against the old glass. Callum arrived soaked through, clutching Eleanor's journal beneath his jacket. Mrs. Alder was waiting near the front desk, a lantern flickering beside her. "Are you sure about this, dear?" she asked. "If you enter Hollow House, you may not come out the same." Callum nodded. "I can't leave Eleanor trapped. And Lydia deserves the truth." Mrs. Alder pressed a small bundle into his hand. "Take this. Salt, iron filings, a silver coin. Old protections. The library taught me well." Callum managed a faint smile. "Thanks, Mrs. Alder. I guess it can't hurt." Mrs. Alder's eyes shone. "Remember, should the house start speaking to you, don't answer it." He swallowed. "Speaking to me?" She gave him a solemn nod. Eleanor appeared then, drifting from the shadows, her presence like a cold breeze. "Callum." He turned to her. "I'm ready." Eleanor gazed at Mrs. Alder, gratitude softening her features. "Thank you for keeping me safe all these years." Mrs. Alder blinked back tears. "I wish I'd been braver, Eleanor." Eleanor reached toward her. Though her fingers passed through Mrs. Alder's sleeve, the older woman gasped as if she'd felt a chill. Callum cleared his throat. "Tell me exactly where the ledger is." Eleanor took a deep breath. "In Hollow House, under the cellar stairs. There's a panel. Behind it, the ledger's hidden in a compartment marked with my initials." Mrs. Alder handed Callum a small iron key. "This will open Hollow House's front door. I've kept it hidden all these years." Callum stared at the key, feeling the weight of history pressing down. "Then let's go," he said. Outside, lightning split the sky. Wind howled through the streets of Windmere as Callum and Eleanor approached Hollow House. Rain splattered the cracked pavement, and shadows leapt wildly under each lightning flash. Hollow House loomed at the end of a narrow lane, its stone facade blackened by decades of storms. Windows stared blankly, dark and glassless, like empty eye sockets. Ivy choked its walls, twisting around iron railings that were rusted and bent. Callum stood at the wrought iron gate, heart hammering. "It feels angry." Eleanor's voice floated beside him. "It remembers everything that happened inside." He slipped Mrs. Alder's iron key into the lock on the massive wooden door. The metal groaned in protest, but finally turned. The door swung inward on a sigh of air cold as a cellar. Inside, the house smelled of damp wood, mildew, and something fainter, an echo of old perfume. Callum stepped over the threshold, lantern held high. Dust hung in thick clouds, swirling in his light. The hallway stretched ahead, paneled in dark wood, its floor littered with fallen plaster. Eleanor drifted past him, moving as weightlessly as smoke. "This way." Callum followed her toward the staircase at the far end of the hall. The steps creaked like bones under his weight. Paintings lined the walls, portraits of stern men and solemn women. Their eyes seemed to follow Callum as he moved. Thunder boomed overhead. At the foot of the stairs leading down into the cellar, Eleanor paused. "This is where he cornered Lydia. He tried to make her give up the ledger." Callum felt a chill crawl up his spine. "And when she wouldn't..." Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. "He pushed her." Lightning flashed, illuminating the sorrow etched across her face. Callum stood frozen at the top of the cellar steps, lantern trembling in his grasp. The shadows seemed to writhe along the walls, as if the house itself was listening. Eleanor drifted closer. "The cellar remembers what he did. Listen carefully. Sometimes it tries to speak the truth." Callum swallowed. "Or tries to scare me away." She gave a sad smile. "Sometimes both." He tightened his grip on the lantern and began his descent. Each step moaned under his weight. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of damp earth and stone. At the bottom of the stairs, the cellar opened into a low chamber with arched brick ceilings. Rusted tools hung from hooks along the walls. Crates lay toppled, spilling straw and broken glass. Callum shone his light across the dirt floor, eyes scanning for any sign of disturbance. "Over there," Eleanor whispered, pointing to the far corner. He crossed the cellar cautiously. His lantern illuminated a section of the brick wall that looked newer than the rest. Mortar slightly lighter, bricks less weathered. Eleanor hovered beside him, Behind that wall is the compartment. The panel slides out if you press the loose brick shaped like a diamond. Callum raised trembling fingers and found the diamond-shaped brick. He pressed it gently. There was a soft click. Slowly, a section of the brick wall shifted, sliding outward to reveal a narrow cavity hidden behind. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a thick ledger bound in deep blue leather. Callum reached in and lifted it out. The leather felt icy, almost vibrating under his fingertips. Eleanor gazed at it with wide, shining eyes. "You've found it. After all these years." Thunder cracked above them, shaking dust from the beams overhead. Callum stared at the ledger. "Let's finish your story." Callum held the ledger close, the weight of it heavy in his hands. The leather cover seemed to pulse faintly, as though eager to be opened after a century of silence. Eleanor drifted nearer, her voice trembling. "Be careful. The truths inside are sharp as knives." Callum glanced around the cellar, shadows pooling thickly in corners. "Let's get out of here. I'd rather not read murder confessions underground." Eleanor nodded, her translucent form gliding up the stairs ahead of him. As Callum followed, the air grew strangely oppressive. Halfway up the steps, he felt a sudden resistance, as though invisible hands were pushing him back. He grunted, leaning into the force. "Eleanor, something's trying to stop me!" She turned, panic in her ghostly eyes. "It's the house. It wants the ledger hidden. It's trying to keep the secret buried." A low, deep groan vibrated through the wooden beams. Dust cascaded from the ceiling. Callum set his jaw and shoved forward. The invisible force pushed harder, but he staggered upward, clutching the ledger like a lifeline. At the top of the stairs, the pressure released all at once. Callum stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath. Eleanor hovered beside him, pale and luminous. "You broke its hold," he exhaled shakily. "I'm not giving up now." They hurried through the darkened halls of Hollow House, the storm still raging outside. Wind howled down the chimneys, rattling loose panes of glass. At the front door, Callum fumbled with the iron key. Finally, the lock turned, and the door creaked open. Rain lashed the porch as Callum stepped into the night, Eleanor drifting beside him like mist. Lightning flashed, illuminating the ancient house one last time. Callum whispered, "It's over, Hollow House." Eleanor gently corrected him, her voice tinged with both hope and fear. "No, it's just beginning." Rain pelted Callum as he raced back toward Windmere Library, the ledger tucked beneath his coat. Eleanor drifted beside him, nearly invisible in the sheets of water. "Faster," she urged, voice barely audible over the storm. "Before the library changes its mind." Callum glanced at her. "Changes its mind? The library doesn't want the truth escaping," Eleanor whispered. "It might try to hide the way back." Callum tightened his grip on the ledger and pushed onward. The streets were deserted, puddles reflecting the wild flashes of lightning. At last, the great stone facade of Windmere Library loomed out of the rain. Callum burst through the heavy doors, water dripping from his hair and clothes. Mrs. Alder stood waiting just inside, lantern in hand. Her eyes widened when she saw the ledger. "Merciful heavens, you did it!" Callum held it out. "This is the proof Eleanor needs. And Lydia." Mrs. Alder ushered him toward a reading table, drawing thick velvet curtains closed around them. The flickering lantern threw golden light over their small circle of space. Eleanor materialized more solidly, her gown shimmering with droplets of phantom rain. Mrs. Alder reached a trembling hand toward the ledger but stopped short of touching it. "Are you ready to see what's inside, dear?" Callum nodded, though his stomach twisted. Slowly, he unwrapped the oilcloth. The ledger's cover gleamed deep blue under the lantern light. Eleanor hovered closer, eyes wide with longing. Callum opened the first page. Rows of neat, slanting handwriting filled the parchment. Names, dates, amounts of money, dark secrets carefully recorded in Barlow's precise script. Mrs. Alder leaned forward, eyes glinting. "This ledger will finish Eleanor's story," Eleanor whispered. And finally free me. Callum turned page after page, reading aloud by the lantern's flickering glow. Each entry was like a dagger driven deeper into Winmere's past. Hush payments, blackmail, threats, and most chillingly, Lydia Gray's name written in bold ink. Payment made to silence Lydia Gray. Witness too much in Hollow House. Must ensure she remains quiet forever. Mrs. Alder gasped, clutching her chest. It's true. Barlow killed her to hide his crimes. Eleanor floated closer, her translucent fingers brushing the page. Tears glistened in her spectral eyes. He stole my words, and her life. Callum's voice trembled. This ledger proves everything. We can show the town. Mrs. Alder shook her head. This will shock Winmere to its roots. Barlow was considered a local hero. His name is on plaques, buildings. Eleanor's voice was soft but firm. A hero built on murder is no hero at all. Mrs. Alder sighed, eyes weary. You're right, child. Secrets fester like wounds. It's time the truth saw daylight. Callum closed the ledger gently. We'll reveal it at the next town council meeting. Let everyone hear Lydia's story, and yours. Eleanor's gaze shimmered with hope. Thank you, Callum. Mrs. Alder placed a hand on his arm. We'll make copies of the ledger. The library can't silence us all. Suddenly, a low rumble shuddered through the floorboards. The lantern's flame danced wildly. Eleanor went pale. The library knows. It's angry. Mrs. Alder gripped Callum's shoulder. Brace yourself, dear. It may try to stop us yet. A sharp wind roared through the library, flinging open books and scattering papers like startled birds. Callum tightened his hold on the ledger. We're not giving up. Shelves trembled as if an invisible earthquake rippled through the building. Books toppled from high places, thumping onto the floor in a rain of leather and paper. Callum ducked as a heavy volume crashed beside him, missing his head by inches. Mrs. Alder shouted over the rising wind. The library is trying to bury the evidence. Hold on to that ledger, Callum. Eleanor drifted in front of him, arms spread wide as if shielding him. Her voice rang out like a bell, clear and sorrowful. This truth belongs to me. To Lydia. You will not keep it hidden. A wail rose from the shelves, a chorus of whispers growing into a roar, thousands of pages fluttering at once. The lantern's flame sputtered, casting shadows that danced like living things along the walls. Callum shouted, Mrs. Alder, what do we do? The old librarian's eyes flashed. There's one place the library can't reach us, the binding circle. Follow me. She seized his arm and dragged him between collapsing shelves. Eleanor glided after them, her glow flickering as the library seemed to tighten around her like a closing fist. They reached a marble mosaic set into the floor near the center of the library. A circle of intertwined symbols glowed faintly, pulsing with soft blue light. Mrs. Alder barked. Stand inside, both of you! Callum stumbled into the circle, gripping the ledger as pages continued flying around them. The instant Eleanor drifted inside the mosaic's edge, the wind died abruptly. Books dropped to the floor with soft, echoing thuds. Silence flooded the library. Callum gasped for breath. What was that? Mrs. Alder wiped sweat from her brow. The library's fury. It wants the secret buried. But here we're safe. For now. Eleanor stared at the ledger, eyes fierce. Then let's finish my story. Inside the binding circle, the library felt different, a pocket of calm amid the chaos. The glow from the marble symbols pulsed like a heartbeat, steady and soothing. Mrs. Alder lowered herself onto a wooden stool, breathing hard. This circle was carved centuries ago. It protects those who seek the truth. The library's influence stops at the edges. Eleanor hovered beside Callum, pale and luminous. Then we must write the ending. Callum glanced at the journal in one hand and the ledger in the other. Where do I start? Eleanor pointed to the journal. Begin where my words left off. Tell the truth of what happened to Lydia. Finish the story Barlow stole. Mrs. Alder pressed a piece of parchment and a fountain pen into his hands. Write quickly, dear. The longer the truth remains unwritten, the stronger the library's hold grows. Callum took a deep breath and began to write. The night was cold in Hollow House, shadows clinging to the corners like secrets. Lydia Gray trembled on the cellar stairs. Jonathan Barlow stood above her, fury twisting his face. He demanded the ledger, but Lydia refused. Eleanor's voice grew stronger as he wrote, echoing in rhythm with his words. Yes, that's how it was. Callum continued, his pen moving faster. Barlow lunged at Lydia, but she twisted away. He shoved her. She fell, striking her head on the stone. The silence that followed was as deep as a grave. Eleanor closed her eyes, tears glistening on her translucent cheeks. Keep going, Callum. Don't stop. Mrs. Alder watched, eyes bright with unshed tears. You're breaking the library's chains, dear. Word by word. Suddenly, the library outside the circle shuddered again. A deep, rumbling growl rose from the floorboards, as if the very stone disapproved. Callum clenched his jaw, gripping his pen. I'm finishing this, whether the library likes it or not. Callum kept writing, even as a shiver coursed through the marble beneath his feet. Jonathan Barlow dragged Lydia's body across the cellar floor. His hands were stained with dust and blood. He pried up the bricks, shoving her beneath the earth. He whispered promises that no one would ever find her. But the house listened. It remembered. Eleanor's voice broke, choked with grief. Yes, yes, the house remembers. Mrs. Alder squeezed Callum's shoulder. Keep going, dear. Don't leave it unfinished. Callum swallowed and dipped his pen again. Barlow sealed the cellar floor and fled into the night. He locked the Hollow House and told the town Lydia had run away. But his guilt seeped into every brick, leaving whispers for those who dared to listen. A gust of wind roared outside the circle, rattling books off shelves in a furious storm. Eleanor cried out. It's fighting us! Mrs. Alder stood tall. Let it fight! This story will be told. Callum pressed on, sweat dripping from his brow. Barlow returned to Windermere Library. He wrote a novel, hiding Lydia's death inside fiction. He erased Eleanor's name and claimed the story as his own. But the library knew. It trapped his theft within its walls, waiting for justice. Eleanor hovered closer, tears streaming down her pale face. You're freeing me, Callum. Mrs. Alder's eyes glistened. One more page, dear. Tell how the truth is found. Callum nodded, hand trembling as he wrote. Over a century later, a young man named Callum Price found the ledger. He chose to finish the story, so Eleanor's voice would echo beyond the shelves, and Lydia Gray's truth would finally see the light. The marble circle pulsed brighter, flooding the library with a soft, blue glow. The glow from the marble circle expanded outward, washing over the shelves like gentle moonlight. The howling wind outside the circle seemed to hush, as though the library itself were pausing to listen. Callum lowered the pen, chest heaving. It's done! Eleanor stared at the final lines on the parchment, her face luminous. You gave me my ending. Mrs. Alder dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief. And freed Lydia's memory. Suddenly, a low groan rolled through the library. The walls shuddered, books trembling in their places. Callum looked around in alarm. Is it angry again? He asked. Eleanor shook her head, eyes wide with wonder. No. It's settling. The binding circle's glow softened to a pale shimmer. Shelves that had leaned at odd angles straightened themselves with soft creaks. Papers that had blown across the floor drifted back into neat piles. Mrs. Alder whispered, It's accepting the truth. Callum released a shaky breath. So, it's over? Eleanor turned to him, a bittersweet smile on her lips. Almost. She reached out a hand. This time, when Callum took it, her touch felt warm, solid, no longer like icy mist. I feel lighter, Eleanor murmured. As if the library is letting me go. A gentle breeze wafted through the room, carrying the faint scent of old lavender. Eleanor's form shimmered, becoming clearer and more radiant than ever. Thank you, Callum, she whispered. for giving me back my words. And for remembering me. Callum blinked back tears. I won't ever forget you. Mrs. Alder stepped closer. Safe travels, dear Eleanor. Eleanor smiled one last time. Goodbye. Then her form grew brighter, glowing like starlight, until she dissolved into a soft, silver mist that spiraled upward and vanished into the library's high arches. For a long moment, silence wrapped the library like a soft blanket. Callum stood staring at the empty space where Eleanor had been, lantern light glimmering in his wet eyes. Mrs. Alder laid a gentle hand on his arm. You did something wonderful tonight, Callum. You freed a soul, and uncovered the truth for an entire town. Callum let out a shuddering breath. It feels unreal. Mrs. Alder gave him a tender smile. That's how the biggest truths often feel. She took the parchment where Callum had written Eleanor's ending and carefully rolled it into a scroll. We'll keep this safe. And we'll share it with Winmere. Lydia deserves her story told, and Eleanor deserves her name restored. Callum nodded, voice low. And what about the ledger? Mrs. Alder's gaze turned somber. We'll give it to the authorities. Even if Barlow is long gone, the truth matters. And there may still be others tied to his secrets. Callum ran a hand through his hair. I can't believe it's over. Mrs. Alder arched an eyebrow. Over? Dear boy, the library never stops collecting stories. It's just waiting for the next one. A wry laugh slipped from Callum. I think I've had enough adventure for a lifetime. She chuckled. Trust me, the library decides when it's enough. Callum glanced around at the high shelves, shadows finally soft and calm again. He felt a warmth in his chest, a mixture of grief and relief. Will she be okay, wherever she went? He asked softly. Mrs. Alder nodded. I believe so. She's free now. And I think she'll finally rest. Together, they began gathering fallen books, the hush of the library settling around them like a comforting sigh. Outside, dawn was breaking. Sunlight spilled in through the tall windows, turning dust motes into floating gold. Winmere Library looked as peaceful as Callum had ever seen it, as though the building itself was sighing in relief. Mrs. Alder carried the ledger and Callum's parchment to her office. I'll lock these away until we can share them with the council. Callum followed her to the threshold. What if the library tries to hide them again? Mrs. Alder gave him a small, confident smile. The binding circle's power lingers. The library can be stubborn, but it respects courage. And you, dear boy, have earned its respect tonight. Callum exhaled, feeling a strange sense of pride and humility. I hope so. He wandered back through the reading room, where the scent of old paper and polished wood felt warm and inviting rather than oppressive. As he passed the shelves, he thought he heard a faint rustle, a whisper like Eleanor's gentle voice. Thank you? He paused, listening. But silence returned, deep and serene. Mrs. Alder rejoined him, wiping her hands on her cardigan. Go home, Callum. Get some sleep. You look half dead. He grinned tiredly. I feel half dead. She patted his cheek. Rest. The library will still be here in the morning. And who knows, perhaps it will even behave for a while. As he left, the rising sun cast long beams across the marble floor, transforming the once terrifying halls into a place of quiet beauty. At the great doors, Callum turned for one last look. The library stood solemn and still, ancient and knowing, its secrets at last beginning to breathe free. And he whispered under his breath, Goodbye, Eleanor. Callum stepped outside into the cool morning air, blinking at the brilliant sky. Rain-washed cobblestones glistened under the rising sun, and Winmere seemed to breathe easier, as though a storm had finally passed. He felt oddly lighter, as if some invisible weight had lifted from his shoulders. Though he was exhausted, he was also filled with quiet determination. As he made his way home, people were beginning to stir in the streets. Mrs. Hargrove, the florist, waved to him from her shop door. You're up early, Callum. He managed a tired grin. Couldn't sleep. She chuckled. Library keeping you busy, I suppose? You have no idea. he murmured under his breath. By the time he reached his small flat above a tailor's shop, the town was awake and humming. Callum collapsed into bed without bothering to change clothes, the events of the past night swirling through his mind like drifting pages. Hours later, he woke to a knock on his door. Blinking sleep from his eyes, he shuffled over and opened it. Mrs. Alder stood there, holding a small wrapped package. "Thought you'd like breakfast," she said. "And I have news." Callum stepped aside to let her in. "Good or bad?" "Good, I think." She handed him the bundle, a warm, fragrant parcel of fresh scones. He tore off a piece gratefully. "So, what news?" Mrs. Alder settled into a chair. "I spoke to the council this morning. They've agreed to hear the evidence about Lydia Gray. We're going to tell the town the truth." Callum stared at her. "Really? They're not going to bury it?" She shook her head. "Not this time. Too many people have suffered from secrets." Callum felt a swell of hope. "Then, Eleanor's story will finally be heard." Mrs. Alder smiled softly. "Yes, dear. And yours too." Callum sat across from Mrs. Alder, the warmth of the scones filling the tiny flat with a comforting scent. "I don't even know what to say," he murmured. "I never thought I'd be part of something like this." Mrs. Alder's eyes twinkled. "Libraries have always been crossroads of fate, dear. Stories waiting to find the right reader. And sometimes, the right hero." He chuckled softly. "Hero might be stretching it." She shook her head firmly. "Don't you downplay what you've done. You freed a soul. You uncovered a hidden crime. You gave a woman her name back." Callum's smile faded as his gaze drifted out the window. "I just wish Eleanor could see Windermere hear her story." Mrs. Alder reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Oh, I think she'll be there in spirit." A week later, the council chamber was packed. Word had spread through Windermere that secrets long buried were about to come into the light. Callum stood at the front beside Mrs. Alder, his palms damp with nerves. An official cleared his throat. "We're here to discuss evidence recently discovered regarding the disappearance of Lydia Gray in 1873. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Callum stepped forward, voice trembling but strong. "A woman named Eleanor Wickham tried to tell this story over 100 years ago. Her words were stolen. Her life, stolen too. She deserves to be heard now." He opened the ledger. Names and dates glistened under the chamber lights. Murmurs surged as townsfolk recognized ancestors and familiar places in the entries. Mrs. Alder spoke next, her voice ringing through the chamber. "Windermere must remember that truth matters more than reputation. Secrets are cages. Tonight, we open the door." Callum closed the ledger gently. "This is for Lydia. And for Eleanor." For a moment, silence settled over the council chamber like a hush in a church. The townsfolk sat frozen, eyes darting between Callum and Mrs. Alder. Then an elderly man rose slowly from a bench near the back. His voice was rough with age and sorrow. "My grandfather worked for Jonathan Barlow. He used to say there were things he saw in Hollow House that haunted him until the day he died." A woman near the front burst into tears. "My family always wondered why Lydia Gray vanished. We thought she'd run away. I can't believe she was murdered." Mrs. Alder laid a gentle hand on Callum's arm. "You're doing splendidly, dear." Callum cleared his throat and continued. "Eleanor Wickham spent her life trying to tell this story. Jonathan Barlow stole her words, published them as fiction, and covered up Lydia's death. Eleanor was trapped in Windermere Library ever since, waiting for someone to finish her story." Gasps filled the room. A younger woman, holding a toddler in her lap, whispered, "All this time, right here in our town." An older man stepped forward. "If the ledger proves it, we must set the record straight. Even if it changes how we remember our past." Callum nodded. "That's all Eleanor wanted. For the truth to be known." Mrs. Alder lifted her chin, voice firm. "I propose the council make this part of our public record, and that Lydia Gray's memory be restored, and Eleanor's as well." A ripple of agreement passed through the chamber. One by one, people rose to their feet, as though waking from a long-held silence. Callum felt tears sting his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. Above them, the brass chandelier swung gently, the light glinting off the polished wood panels. When Mir, at last, was ready to listen. After the council meeting, people clustered around Callum and Mrs. Alder, some shaking their hands, others weeping quietly. The weight of generations seemed to lift from the gathered crowd, replaced by relief and sorrow. A woman with silver hair approached Callum, her voice trembling. "My great-grandmother was Lydia's friend. She always said Lydia would never have left without a word. Thank you for giving us the truth." Callum swallowed a lump in his throat. "She deserves to be remembered properly." The woman squeezed his hand, then moved aside for others to speak. Mrs. Alder beamed at him. "Look what you've done, dear. You've healed a wound older than any of us." Callum managed a tired smile. "I didn't do it alone." They stepped outside into the crisp night air. Stars glimmered high above Windmere, and the breeze smelled of rain and freshly fallen leaves. Mrs. Alder looked up at the sky. "Funny, isn't it? The stars look the same as they did the night Eleanor vanished. And yet the world feels different now." Callum glanced around the quiet streets. "Do you think Eleanor knows?" Mrs. Alder's eyes shone. "I believe she does. And I believe she's finally at peace." They strolled slowly back toward the library, their steps echoing against the cobblestones. When they reached the great double doors, Callum paused, gazing up at the building's towering facade. "I used to think this place was just bricks and books," he said softly. "But it's alive, isn't it?" Mrs. Alder smiled. "As alive as any heart that's ever beat." Callum placed his hand against the cool stone. For a moment, he thought he felt a gentle pulse beneath his fingers, a quiet acknowledgement from the library itself. And somewhere, faint and delicate, he could have sworn he heard Eleanor's voice whisper, "Thank you, Callum." The next day dawned bright and clear. Callum arrived at the library to find the usual morning crowd already milling about, whispering excitedly about the revelations from the council meeting. Mrs. Alder waved him over from the main desk. "You're famous, dear," she said with a sly grin. Callum groaned. "I didn't do it for fame." "I know," she said warmly. "But people are grateful. You've done something wonderful for this town." He glanced around the library, noticing how differently it felt. The shadows were still there, but they seemed gentler somehow, less heavy. Shelves that once loomed felt more like old friends leaning in to listen. Mrs. Alder leaned closer. "Several folks asked if we'd consider creating a display about Lydia and Eleanor. A way to tell their story properly." Callum's eyes widened. "That's perfect. I thought so too," Mrs. Alder said, eyes twinkling. "I've already set aside a corner near the main reading room. We'll display Eleanor's journal, at least a copy, and photographs of Hollow House. And Lydia's name will be remembered as it should be." Callum felt his chest tighten with emotion. She'd have loved that. Mrs. Alder tilted her head. "And you, dear, what will you do next?" Callum looked thoughtful. "I think I'll stay here. Keep working. There's still so many stories waiting to be told." Mrs. Alder smiled. "Good answer." They turned as a breeze swept through the library, rustling pages and fluttering loose sheets of paper. And though either of them said a word, both felt it at the same time, a soft, invisible presence passing between the shelves. Eleanor, lingering in gratitude and peace. Over the following week, Windmere seemed transformed. People stopped Callum on the streets to thank him. Even those who had once whispered fearfully about the library now gazed at it with cautious respect. The display honoring Lydia Gray and Eleanor Whitcomb took shape quickly. Callum and Mrs. Alder arranged copies of Eleanor's journal pages beneath protective glass. Old photographs of Hollow House were hung on the walls, along with a printed page listing names from Barlow's ledger. Visitors moved through the display with quiet reverence. Some left flowers, or folded scraps of paper bearing small messages of gratitude. One afternoon, Callum stood watching an older man who wiped tears from his eyes. The man turned and clasped Callum's hand. My family carried guilt for generations, thinking we'd abandoned Lydia. Now we know the truth. Thank you? Callum could only nod, speechless. Late that evening, after the last patrons had left, Callum remained in the library, reorganizing shelves. The hush was peaceful now, a gentle quiet, not an ominous one. As he dusted a high shelf, he felt a sudden warmth behind him. Hello, Callum? He turned quickly. Eleanor stood there, more luminous than ever, her form soft and golden in the lamplight. He blinked in astonishment. Eleanor, I thought you'd moved on. She smiled. I have. But I wanted to see it, the world knowing my story. Callum felt emotion clogging his throat. You deserve every word. Eleanor drifted closer, her gaze shimmering. Thank you, Callum, for giving me my name back. And for freeing Lydia. He swallowed hard. Will you stay? She shook her head gently. No. It's time. But the library will remember me. And so will you. She reached out, fingers brushing his cheek like a breath of cool air. Goodbye, Callum, she whispered. Callum felt tears sting his eyes as Eleanor's touch faded. Her form began to shimmer, dissolving into a cascade of tiny silver sparks that drifted upward like fireflies. He reached for her, though he knew he could not hold her. Goodbye, Eleanor. Her voice echoed faintly as the last sparks vanished into the shadows above the shelves. Thank you for finishing my story. For a long moment, Callum stood perfectly still, listening to the soft hush that settled over the library like a blanket. The shadows seemed lighter now. The hush felt like peace rather than secrecy. Mrs. Alder appeared from the far aisle, leaning on her cane. She gave him a knowing look. She came back to say farewell, didn't she? Callum nodded, unable to speak around the lump in his throat. Mrs. Alder smiled gently. She's free, Callum. And so are you. He managed a shaky laugh. Do you think the library will ever stop surprising me? Mrs. Alder chuckled. Not as long as there are stories left to tell. Together they began turning off the lamps. The hush of Windmere Library felt warm and safe, like the gentle hush before sleep. Callum paused by the display case one last time, gazing at Eleanor's journal and Lydia's photograph. He laid his hand on the glass. I'll keep telling your story, he whispered, and all the others waiting to be heard. Mrs. Alder called softly from the doorway. Come along, dear. We've earned some rest. Callum cast one last look at the shelves. Somewhere, he thought he heard pages turning, a sound like a contented sigh. Then he stepped into the night, stars bright above Windmere, the library glowing behind him like a lantern shining through the dark. A few days later, the new display became Windmere's pride. Local papers ran headlines. Secret Ledger uncovers 150-year-old mystery. Library ghost story finally told. People arrived from nearby towns just to glimpse Eleanor's journal and the ledger's chilling entries. The library, once whispered about in fear, was suddenly filled with warmth and curious visitors. Callum found himself busier than ever, guiding guests through the display, answering questions about Lydia and Eleanor. One afternoon, as he rearranged books, a teenage girl lingered by the glass case, staring at Lydia's faded photograph. Is it true? She asked softly. That a ghost was trapped here? Callum smiled gently. Yes. But she wasn't scary. She just wanted someone to hear her story. The girl bit her lip. I think that's kind of beautiful. It is, Callum agreed. Stories matter. They keep people alive, even long after they're gone. She grinned and skipped away to tell her friends. Later that evening, Callum wandered the library aisles alone, the lamps casting gentle amber light. He felt a strange comfort in the hush, as if Eleanor's presence still lingered, watching over him. At the far end of the shelves, Mrs. Alder appeared, leaning on her cane. You look peaceful tonight, she said. Callum nodded. It's different now. The library feels lighter. Mrs. Alder chuckled. Because secrets weigh down even walls of stone. They stood quietly, listening to the soft ticking of the library clock. Mrs. Alder reached out and squeezed his hand. "You're exactly where you belong, Callum." He smiled. "I think so too." The next morning dawned crisp and golden. Autumn leaves scattered across Windermere's streets, swirling in little spirals as Callum made his way to the library. Inside, the usual quiet hum of patrons filled the air. Sunlight spilled through high windows, dust motes dancing like flecks of gold. Mrs. Alder waved him over from the front desk. "You've got mail, dear." She handed him a cream-colored envelope, sealed with deep blue wax. Callum raised an eyebrow. "Fancy." Mrs. Alder leaned forward, eyes twinkling. "It's from the Historical Society. I have a feeling they're rather intrigued by your discoveries." Callum broke the seal and unfolded the letter. His eyes widened as he read. "Dear Mr. Price, your recent findings regarding Lydia Gray and Eleanor Whitcomb have come to our attention. We would be honored if you would speak at our upcoming conference on History and Hidden Truths." He blinked. "They want me to give a talk?" Mrs. Alder beamed. "Of course they do. You've unearthed a story hidden for over a century. People want to hear it from the man who finished it." Callum laughed nervously. "I've never given a speech to a crowd in my life." She patted his shoulder. "Oh, nonsense. You spoke beautifully at the council meeting. And this time, you'll be speaking for Eleanor and Lydia. Let their courage carry you." Callum folded the letter carefully. "You're right. They deserve to be remembered beyond Windermere." Mrs. Alder squeezed his hand. "Then go tell the world, dear boy." Callum gazed around the shelves. "Think the library will let me go without a fight?" Mrs. Alder chuckled. "Oh, it'll let you go. It knows you'll always come back." That afternoon, Callum sat at a table near the library windows, pen in hand, staring at a blank page. Outside, leaves tumbled across the square, and the autumn sky glowed soft and pale. He began writing notes for his upcoming talk. Eleanor Whitcomb was more than a ghost. She was a woman who refused to be silenced. He paused, remembering her gentle voice, her sorrow, and the fierce determination in her eyes. Mrs. Alder arrived with 2 steaming mugs of tea. She set one beside him. "Writing again, I see?" Callum smiled faintly. "Trying to. But it's hard to know where to start." She settled into a chair across from him. "Start where all stories start, dear. With truth." Callum's expression softened. Eleanor was right. The library really does remember everything. And sometimes, it chooses the right person to help. Mrs. Alder winked. "I suspect the library chose you long before you ever knew it." An hour later, Callum wandered among the shelves, fingers trailing along book spines. The hush felt different now, like a comforting friend rather than a lurking presence. He reached a familiar aisle and paused, closing his eyes. For a fleeting instant, he imagined Eleanor standing beside him, her lantern casting soft light over the shelves. "I'm proud of you, Callum." He smiled to himself. Nearby, a pair of teenagers whispered excitedly about the display. "Do you really think there are other ghosts in here?" one asked. Callum turned to them, his voice gentle. "Maybe. But remember, ghosts are often just stories waiting to be heard." They exchanged wide-eyed glances and scurried off to explore. Callum shook his head, a soft laugh escaping his lips. "Stories waiting to be heard," he murmured. "That's all any of us are." That evening, after the library closed, Callum and Mrs. Alder stayed behind to tidy up. The glow of the lamps cast long, warm beams over the floor, and the hush felt like a gentle breath. Mrs. Alder dusted off a high shelf. "You know, dear, the library's quieter these days. As if it's content." Callum glanced around, listening to the peaceful creaks of the building. "It's because Eleanor's story has an ending now. She's not trapped anymore." Mrs. Alder nodded thoughtfully. "Stories don't like to be kept silent. Nor do spirits." They worked side by side for a while in companionable silence. Later, Callum found himself back at the display, standing in front of Eleanor's journal. He traced a finger over the glass case, remembering her voice, the sorrow, and the courage that had shaped their journey. A soft glow seemed to flicker over the pages, like moonlight caught on water. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Sleep well, Eleanor. You're free." He turned to go, but paused as a gentle rustling rose from the shelves. Pages shifting, like a library sighing in relief. Mrs. Alder appeared beside him, leaning on her cane. "It'll always remember her, you know. And it will always remember you." Callum smiled. "I'll keep coming back." She chuckled. "Of course you will. Libraries have a way of keeping those who belong." They stood together, looking over the peaceful aisles, the hush wrapping around them like a soft blanket. Outside, the first stars appeared in the sky, shimmering faintly above Windmere. Inside, the library glowed warm and alive, a place of stories told, secrets released, and new tales waiting to be born. Days turned into weeks, and Windmere slowly settled into its new normal. People continued to visit the library, drawn by the story of Lydia Gray and the ghost who'd waited over a century to speak. Callum became something of a local celebrity, though he often blushed whenever anyone called him a hero. One afternoon, he sat in the library's sunny alcove, reading a letter from the Historical Society confirming his invitation to speak. Mrs. Alder bustled over. "Well, dear, how's your speech coming?" Callum rubbed his temple. "I'm trying to make it perfect." She laughed softly. "Stories don't have to be perfect, Callum. They just have to be true." He lowered the letter. "I keep thinking about Eleanor. About how many other voices might still be waiting." Mrs. Alder sobered. "There are always voices waiting. The library will keep them safe until someone's ready to listen." Callum looked around at the towering shelves. "It's funny. I used to think of the library as a place full of old books. Now I feel like it's alive." Mrs. Alder patted his hand. "Because it is. The shelves breathe. The pages whisper. And every reader leaves part of themselves behind." He tilted his head. "Do you think Eleanor's completely gone?" Mrs. Alder's eyes twinkled. "I think she's free. But perhaps a piece of her still walks these halls, keeping an eye on you." Callum smiled. "I'd like that." As the sun slipped lower in the sky, the library filled with a golden hush. The air smelled of paper and old wood, comforting as a childhood memory. And in the silence, Callum felt it again, a soft whisper brushing the edges of his mind. "Tell the next story." The next morning, Callum arrived early at the library, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. A gentle autumn chill filled the air, and golden leaves skittered across the square like playful ghosts. Inside, sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching on the dust motes swirling lazily in the hush. Callum made his way to the archives. He opened a thick leather ledger labeled "Uncatalogued Donations." Mrs. Alder peeked in, eyes crinkling with curiosity. "What are you hunting for now, dear?" Callum grinned. "New mysteries. New unfinished stories." Mrs. Alder chuckled. "The library is full of them. Some have been waiting longer than Eleanor's." He carefully flipped pages, scanning entries written in spidery old handwriting. One record caught his eye. "Donation, personal journal, unknown author. Found behind a fireplace in Hollow House during renovations, 1956. His pulse quickened. He glanced up at Mrs. Alder. "Another journal from Hollow House?" She tilted her head thoughtfully. "I never knew about that one. Perhaps it's been waiting for you." Callum gently lifted a small, dusty box from the archive shelf. Inside lay a thin journal bound in cracked maroon leather. He turned the first page. Faded ink spelled out a name he'd never seen before. "My name is Lydia Gray." Callum sucked in a breath. It's her own words. Mrs. Alder pressed a hand to her chest. "Merciful heavens! Lydia left her own account?" Callum swallowed hard. "I think this might be her side of the story. The part even Eleanor didn't know." Mrs. Alder smiled through her tears. "Looks like the library isn't done with you yet, dear." Callum nodded, heart pounding. "Then let's keep reading." Callum carefully carried Lydia's journal to a reading table bathed in soft morning light. Mrs. Alder followed, her cane tapping gently on the floor. He opened the fragile book, the scent of old paper wafting upward like a breath from the past. On the first page, Lydia's words continued. I am writing these words because I fear I will not live to speak them. Jonathan Barlow has secrets he would kill to keep hidden. If anything happens to me, let this be my truth. Mrs. Alder leaned closer, voice barely a whisper. Lydia knew she was in danger. Callum turned the page. More faded writing filled the paper, tense and slanted as though written in fear. He thinks I do not know about the ledger. But I have seen it. I know who he paid. I know the names. I wish I could tell Eleanor, but he's watching me. I'm afraid that if I try to run, he will find me in Hollow House. Callum's chest tightened. She tried to protect Eleanor. And Winmere. Mrs. Alder dabbed her eyes. Poor child. She deserved better. Callum kept reading. If you find this journal, please tell the truth. Let Eleanor know I believed her story. Let Winmere know I didn't run away. I was silenced. But I leave my words here for someone to find. Please, remember me. Tears stung Callum's eyes as he looked up. She was begging for someone to finish her story, too. Mrs. Alder placed a trembling hand over his. Then we must make sure Winmere hears Lydia's voice as loudly as Eleanor's. Callum nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. We will. She won't be forgotten. Outside, sunlight spilled across the library steps, as though even the dawn wanted to help illuminate the truth. Callum and Mrs. Alder spent the rest of the morning carefully transcribing Lydia's journal, preserving every trembling word. Each page felt like Lydia herself reaching across time, whispering truths no one had dared to hear. By early afternoon, Mrs. Alder set down her pen with a sigh. There. Now Winmere will know both sides of the story. Callum gazed at the neat pages. It's like Eleanor and Lydia are speaking together now. Mrs. Alder nodded. Two women bound by truth, and finally set free. The following week, the library held a special evening event. Candles flickered among the bookshelves, casting warm, flickering light over rows of chairs filled with townsfolk. Mrs. Alder stepped to the front and cleared her throat. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we bring you the words of Lydia Gray, in her own voice, at last. Callum approached the podium, heart pounding as he held Lydia's journal. He glanced at Mrs. Alder, who gave him an encouraging nod. He began to read, voice shaking but growing stronger with every sentence. I didn't run away. I loved Winmere. I loved my friends. I loved the quiet hush of the library where secrets waited to be found. I died because I learned too much. But I want Winmere to remember me as I was, a woman who believed the truth matters, no matter how long it takes to be told. Gasps and soft sobs rippled through the room. Mrs. Alder dabbed her eyes, whispering, Well done, dear. When Callum finished, he closed the journal gently. A hush fell, heavy with grief and hope alike. Then the audience began to applaud, soft at first, then swelling into a standing ovation. Callum felt tears spill down his cheeks. Lydia was finally heard. As the applause faded, Callum stepped down from the podium, breathless and trembling. Mrs. Alder slipped an arm through his and guided him gently toward the back of the room. Proud doesn't even begin to cover it, dear, she murmured, her eyes shining. Callum managed a small, shaky smile. I just read her words. Mrs. Alder patted his arm. You did far more than that. You gave Lydia back her voice, and gave Eleanor peace. All around them, townsfolk gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed, reverent tones. Many wiped tears from their eyes. Others clutched copies of the newly printed pamphlet containing Lydia's journal excerpts. A teenage boy approached Callum, clutching his pamphlet. Mr. Price, my grandma said our family used to be friends with Lydia's. Thank you for telling the truth. She always said Lydia wasn't the kind of person to run away. Callum swallowed hard. Lydia was brave. She deserves to be remembered that way. Mrs. Alder leaned closer to the boy. Now you'll help remember her, won't you? The boy nodded solemnly. I will. Later that night, after the last guests had departed, Callum and Mrs. Alder remained in the library, extinguishing candles and straightening chairs. Mrs. Alder paused near the display, resting her hand on the glass case holding Eleanor's journal and Lydia's photograph. It's quiet tonight, she said softly. A good quiet. Callum nodded, feeling a gentle warmth in his chest. Do you think the library's content now? Mrs. Alder smiled. I think it's proud of you, Callum. And I think it's ready for the next story. Callum laughed gently. I guess I am too. Mrs. Alder and Callum stood together beneath the library's high arches, the soft glow of lanterns casting gentle pools of gold on the polished floor. The hush felt full, like a place finally at peace. Callum walked slowly among the shelves, running his fingertips over the spines of old books. Each one felt alive, humming quietly, as though the library itself was breathing. He paused near the binding circle, tracing the symbols etched into the marble. A faint warmth pulsed under his fingers. Mrs. Alder joined him, leaning on her cane. The library has many secrets still, but it trusts you now, Callum. He looked up, thoughtful. Do you ever wonder how many more stories are waiting in these shelves? How many voices still want to be heard? Mrs. Alder chuckled. It's endless, dear. And that's what makes it beautiful. Callum smiled. I used to think libraries were quiet places. Now I know they're the loudest places in the world, if you know how to listen. Mrs. Alder's eyes twinkled. That's why you belong here. They stood together in the warm hush, the scent of old paper wrapping around them like a familiar blanket. Outside, dawn crept over Windermere, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds. The town felt lighter somehow, as if the shadows had shifted, making room for truth and remembrance. Callum took a deep breath. Well, I suppose I should get back to work. Mrs. Alder patted his arm. Go on then. The library's waiting for you. He turned toward the stacks, ready for whatever story might find him next. And as he stepped forward, he heard, just for an instant, a familiar voice whispering on the breeze between the shelves. Thank you, Callum, for listening. And Windermere Library stood tall and silent around him, a guardian of stories, ready to begin again.